So what is neoliberalism? Well, the fact of the matter is, that's almost too big of a question to answer with any degree of absolute certainty. It's going to be a little vague, a little abstract. Why? Because it refers to, as I'm going to argue, a philosophy of life. It refers to economic theory. It talks about how we ought to do business, but it also begins to explain how we ought to think about human beings and how we should value human beings. And many neoliberals might not claim that. They might say, no, we're not telling you how to think about other human beings. But when we follow through on some of the arguments regarding what neoliberalism is supposed to be, I think we'll see that in fact it is a philosophy of life and human value. And you might not like it. Now, in all fairness, I'm going to share my own bias. I don't like it. I think it's terrible. Has it been partially successful? In some respects, yeah. There's almost always, no matter how bad the theory, when it's practiced, there's often some success. But when we think about it, have the promises of neoliberalism been fulfilled? I think you'll see that it's absolutely not the case. We're going to respond to Julie Wilson's neoliberalism text from 2018. We're going to look at some of her arguments, a fairly recent text, very interesting text. And we want to ask, what is neoliberalism? Why is it dangerous? And then we want to apply that to my own life. So if you're willing to stick through this whole video, at the end, I'm going to talk about how neoliberalism relates to my broken leg and why that might matter to how we run the world. What is neoliberalism? Where to even begin? Well, it's safe to say that neoliberalism is how we do business. You may not be a business person, but it refers to all the interactions or exchanges you have to do with money. Whether it's politics, has a lot to do with money, how we run schools. Obviously, you probably go to school or have gone to school. Do you pay taxes or ought you to pay taxes? Neoliberalism impacts how all of these things are thought through. But it goes deeper than that. Of course, it has to do whether or not you have unions or strong unions, people who will defend your labor rights. Are you going to have a pension when you retire? What is your retirement age? It used to be 65 in Ontario. Now many people are working well beyond 65 and carrying a debt load well past the age of 65. Obvious ones are healthcare. Do you have healthcare? How is it thought through? What is the philosophy of human health? Is it a right, or is it something you're expected to pay for? Maybe a little more close to home, neoliberalism has an impact on, during the COVID crisis, how your government responds. Is your government rushing to fortify big business, or is it rushing to help the average person more directly? Is there an assumption, sort of an indirect help, by helping the billionaires, I somehow help the average person? Or is it more of a common good argument, as we will discuss? Moreover, what do you think about inequality, or how do other people think about radical inequality in your country? Because I guarantee it's there, right? It's everywhere. Inequality, where some people have these extreme amounts of wealth and some people have none. Well, how people think about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is a response to neoliberalism as the dominant theory today in the world. So this is a very important topic that has everything to do with how we run, well, not everything, much to do with how we run the planet. Let's start with a definition from a famous scholar, David Harvey. It's a little wordy, stick with me. From his A Brief History of Neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a theory of political economic practices. A theory of political economic practices. Okay, so practices that are both political and economic, that presupposes that human well-being can be best advanced, so human well-being can be made better by liberating you and I as individuals, not as a group, entrepreneurial freedoms and skills. Human life, well-being, will be better when something happens to free us to be good business people, to do something with money and take risks and take market actions, kind of a wordy thing. So let me say it again really quick. Neoliberalism is a theory of political economic practices that proposes that human well-being can be best advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills, a little harder part here, within an institutional framework characterized by strong private property rights, we're going to talk about that, free markets, we're going to talk about that, and free trade. The role of the state, the government, is to create an institutional framework appropriate to such practices. So the government has a role, a very limited role, to get you and I free in our entrepreneurial efforts, our business efforts. That's the goal, that's the purpose, that's the very soul of the government ought to be doing that. And when it fails that, human well-being is said to suffer. Okay, well, let's say this a different way, in more wordier terms, if there is such a thing. If there is strong, unfettered economic competition between individuals in the marketplace, it will be good for everyone. Money wars, show me the money. It's survival of the fittest. It's evolution meets capitalism. It's fight, fight, fight. The goal is profit. Everyone as individuals fighting for a profit is said to have this strange effect, a trickle-down economics as we'll talk about, a strange effect on the rest of society. So everyone trying to be a Bill Gates, everybody trying to be an Elon Musk will have a positive outcome. So goes the theory. We need to get people to act with financial risk, with the goal of profit, to be enterprising. Maybe you've heard that phrase before, enterprising. And this will create, these are my words, a particular biome or an ecology of human existence. So it's kind of like, think about nature with all its diversity and all its interactions, and there's tensions, and there's corruption and death, but there's also life. All these things are interconnected. Well, neoliberalism is pointing to its own version of a biome or an economic nature, and it believes that at the top of this, what drives this nature, this free market economy, are things like your entrepreneurial skill, the willingness to take a chance, to spend money maybe, to invest, but this has a lot to do with private property rights and things like that, which we'll get into. So neoliberalism is a philosophy of life that you and I are expected to, we have to participate in. Unless you are independently wealthy already and live on a deserted island, given that it's everywhere, it's just something that we have to do. But it goes deeper than that by talking about human value, as we will see. What makes a life good? What makes a person good? Well, neoliberalism has an answer for that. Right? Maybe you feel it already by thinking about wealth and profit. We're going to go there. The scope of this conversation, in other words, is incredible. I still can't say neoliberalism. I've had to restart 3 times now. Neoliberalism. One of the first ways to begin to think about it is this idea that government is too big. We need to get rid of government. The red tape alone is terrible. The red tape of big government, people not knowing what they're doing necessarily, everybody in government trying to have hands-on business, well, they mess it up. They're too slow to respond. They don't understand savvy business practices. A sense of competition is lacking when you're the government. I mean, let's say you own everything already, so what's your impetus for real competition and risk and whatnot? And this leads to a bad economy. And a bad economy leads to a bad life. So we need to get rid of government oversight. It slows everything down. It makes things worse. And in response, the businesses will run themselves, whether it's Microsoft or Google or the oil industry or the health industry, whatever, they'll run themselves because it's in their best interests to be successful, hopefully to have a good product and to do well in business so that people will keep buying from them. We just let loose, get the chains off big business or small business, any business, and let people do their own thing. In so much as the government works to maintain that free space, it's a good government. It's maintaining a free space, sort of a neutral area where people can do business without interfering directly. It's a good government. And so we should trust big banks because big banks couldn't possibly make a profit and rip us off and cause a 2008 housing crisis because of greed, because that would be bad business for them. And yet they did. Well, then we should trust big tech companies. They won't possibly steal our privacy, our private information and resell our data without our, but they did that too. There's this argument that with neoliberalism, there has to be a real trust that the mechanisms or the biomes or the ecology of this free market economy will regulate itself in a healthy way. And it's so obvious that that hasn't happened with big banks that needed to be bailed out, with big tech that seems to have limitless access to our privacy, with almost no laws governing it. Laws are very hard to keep up with that sort of thing. And so we're expected to trust even the most brutal of unsavory profiteering individuals. If they're successful in business, millionaires and billionaires, those are the people we're supposed to trust because they've shown the muscle of the free market. They've shown they can win capitalism, whatever that might mean. They can win capitalism. So these are the people we're to look to as exemplars winning capitalism. But the argument we're going to hear is, in fact, winning capitalism not only doesn't make you a good person, in many ways, it could be priming you to dehumanize other people. This is kind of an obvious point. If all of your thinking is about profit and money, what about the people who simply can't make it or are in a situation where they need help, but it's not there? Okay, we'll talk about that. So government, hands off. We don't want any bullies. We don't want any parents. We don't want any overlords. Therefore, neoliberalism believes we'll be fair, or there'll be a greater sense of fairness and happy people. Trusting, again, in the free market. It's a meritocracy. You will get what you deserve if you work hard. If you work hard, you put your hours in, you participate in the market, you should be rewarded. You might not be a Bill Gates. You might not be the next Elon Musk, but you should be able to pay for a house or a car or something like that if you put the time in. Is that a myth? Is this middle-class dream of survivability even achievable anymore? Or has that gone? Like for the last generation, it's gone. And that's what a lot of people will point to, that neoliberalism, the promise of a paradise of sorts, just a middle-class paradise, not where we're all billionaires, but a middle-class paradise, hasn't emerged. What has emerged is radical inequality, far more than anyone had ever envisioned before. More billionaires than ever before. But we'll see. We're getting ahead of ourselves here. Let me say that I would think neoliberalism, on the surface at least, is a very attractive idea. It appeals to the sense of human dignity, letting individuals be free. Individuals to be free, to enter the market, to do what you want with your money. And who wants more parents? I don't want more parents. I have enough parents. Who wants people telling us what to do? I don't want people telling me what to do. But what happens when there are genuinely greedy, corrupt people in society and there's no one to keep them in check? What do we do with that kind of thinking? Well, this will come back later on. So neoliberalism has a huge selling point in so much as it appeals to human freedom. What does that mean? It's not clear. Freedom became a huge, freedom, especially in America, has always been a huge term, but everywhere, it's a big term. Everybody wants to be free. After the attacks of 9/11, freedom became the thing that the terrorists were fighting against. The terrorists didn't want us to be free, or anybody to be free. Did that make sense? I'm not sure that made sense, but there was this idea that freedom was under attack. And neoliberalism frames things like socialism and communism and all these isms, these bad things, as the thing that wants to take away your freedom, that wants to take your decision ability, your choosing ability away. Again, and that makes sense. I don't like the idea of someone telling me what to do. But for the sake of society, some forced redistribution of wealth, where somebody forces me to give up 10, 20, 30% of my income so that it can be redistributed for roads or healthcare, maybe that is kind of necessary. And many neoliberals will say taxation to some degree is absolutely necessary. There needs to be a functioning government and roads and infrastructure, so there's some, but minimal. The logic, again, I'm not free if other people are making choices for me. Any collective judgments are dangerous. And the radical side of neoliberalism really mistrusts democracy in that sense. And we'll get to that too in just a minute. So we're talking about freedom. Let's frame that as freedom toward and freedom away from. Freedom toward and freedom away from. So what is it in neoliberalism, freedom toward? Well, again, it's the freedom to enter the free market, to spend money how you want. You can put your money in the backyard. You dig a hole, put the money in, no problem. Or you could put it all into stocks, or you could do all these different things. Free to do what you want, as long as it's not breaking any crime, as long as it's not hurting other people's ability to also be working in the free market to be a business person. So we have freedom to do business. But is that freedom? Do I have a choice to not do business? No, I have no choice. I have to enter the free market if I want to survive. And when you begin to think about the global context, given that neoliberalism is virtually everywhere, even communist countries, China, you see this neoliberal ideology everywhere. We don't have a choice. If you want to eat, you have to be a part of it. So that already the idea of freedom towards doing business seems a little bit misplaced or suspicious. But freedom in general, still a good ideal. Another big selling point of neoliberalism is the idea that private property rights are very important. Your stuff is your stuff, my stuff is my stuff, nobody can mess with it. If you can't trust that your stuff is your stuff, you're going to be demotivated. Why would I work to build a house and have a career and pay my mortgage if someone can just come in and take it away? That's pretty common sense. But the idea of private property rights, or just property rights in general, rather than, say, a strictly communist country where the government owns everything, the belief is that that will fuel technological development, which in turn pushes greater efficiencies and productivity, and there'll be a snowball effect. If I can see my wealth growing and it's exciting and it's mine, I'm going to want to create more wealth for my family, more wealth for my family's family, and it'll be this just ever-inflating positivity. You've heard the phrase, and part of this is you've heard the phrase trickle-down economics, or you may have heard the phrase a rising tide lifts all boats. The notion, these are both metaphors, but the notion here is that if I'm personally successful, that will just sort of seep into the rest of society as well, because I'm buying cars, or I'm buying, again, a house or a boat or something, and other people are making those and they're selling those. So the more we share in the wealth, I may not be a millionaire or billionaire again, but the more we share, the more it trickles down to people who have less, and it rises them up like a tide, like they're in a boat. In that way, poverty is said to be something we can get rid of if we all practice neoliberalism, if trickle-down economics is true, if wealth does have this sort of spreading snowball effect. Then my question to you is, has it worked? Are there more and more middle-class people with fewer and fewer poor? Now, it depends where you look. Something like China has had a huge revolution where poverty, the people have been brought up out of poverty in an unbelievable way. But that's a communist country. It's hard to really sort of say that's an example of neoliberalism. A little closer to home in Canada, the United States, you need to start looking at the stats. What is the average income, inflation? And we'll look at this again in just a few moments, but it seems pretty clear that overall there are more and more elites, again, people with vast sums of money that aren't sharing them. But is that wealth trickling down? Are there, again, the question that we keep returning to, more and more middle-class people? The answer is no. The answer is no. Debt loads, all-time high. Precarious job situations, all-time high. I shouldn't say all-time high. It's very high. Of course, these things go up and down, so I don't want to be too general here. What do we do with this? Well, let's look at the next one. Freedom from something. Neoliberalism as freedom from something. Again, the attraction is freedom from government, from this idea of parents, freedom from being told what to do. So this is going freedom toward, but now freedom from. So we have an enemy in sight. Freedom from the people who are overlords telling us what to do. Is that a sustainable philosophy of life, where we genuinely don't listen to anybody, where anybody who might have authority over us is kind of cut down? What does that mean about experts? What does that mean about the average person who votes for a prime minister, a president, or a political party? What does it mean when this radical individuality runs up against things like democracy? Well, there's going to be a problem. There's going to be a problem. So this freedom from authority might also be a short-circuiting of any kind of commonality or dialogue or democracy. We'll get to that. Privatization is a big problem. It's a big thing. You've heard this before, where the individual owns their own thing, but this also spreads out to the energy sector, healthcare, governments that own certain resources, whether natural resources, either give them over or sort of sublet to other companies that are run privately. And the belief is that having these private, let's say tomorrow I buy all of the hydro going through Canada. I was thinking about doing that, so I might just do that as an experiment. I'm going to buy all of these plants, and coal plants and nuclear powered plants. I'm going to buy them. Because I want to make money, I'm going to streamline what I'm doing. I'm going to make sure there's any bloat or excess labor force. I'm going to let them go, and I'm going to be profit oriented. And by doing that, I'm going to increase the efficiency of all the power plants because I want to make money, which means people will hopefully be paying less for power. because there'll be fewer people that I have to pay. There'll be less bureaucratic red tape, hopefully. The quality should go up because I want to sell this stuff, and if I'm giving you dirty power, it's always fluctuating or something like that, you're not going to want it. It's going to be upsetting. I'm going to do everything I can to reduce my own costs, which will be important for then, of course, reducing your costs. And then overall, the idea is that privatization leads to cheaper stuff. Cheaper stuff, and hopefully reduced tax burden on everybody else. My question is, have we seen this happen in society today, where quality gets better and better and better, and products get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper? Not just that products get cheaper, but that things get better. That's the mixing ratio. I will argue that no, in fact, many things are not cheaper. The most important things, like homes and cars and education, have not been getting cheaper. When you compensate for things like inflation, the average income has not been skyrocketing. Many will argue that it's either been in decline or flatlining for decades, which means people aren't making more and more money. And quality, I don't know if you've purchased a car recently or a computer. Some of these things are decent quality, but they're all built to be obsolete, to fail very quickly. And we know the famous made in China. If you're buying something cheap, you can't expect it to be quality. But the promise of neoliberalism is that we should be having cheap products and services and quality. Broken promise. Ouch. Another issue that Wilson picks up on is this idea under the neoliberal banner that people who push for that typically like the idea of withdrawing social services. And in withdrawing social services, again, I'll argue there's a revaluing of human dignity and human worth. While everyone is free, neoliberalism, liberal, you're free to enter the marketplace, what ends up happening is that you also then become responsible for whatever happens. There's this radical individuality that develops so that if you are not successful in the marketplace, that's not the market's fault. If you're not successful in the marketplace and let's say you're poor, that you can't blame neoliberals or anybody else. You are simply to blame because you were able to enter into the market of your own free will. One of the big discussions that a lot of people have when talking about neoliberalism is withdrawal of social services. And I was always surprised. I mean, you would see these Congress people in the US and politicians in general not wanting to give money to people who needed it. It was always a conflict in my mind. It was always strange. Most recently, as an example, the Republican Party, pre-Biden, argued that the tax cut to the wealthy, to the businesses, was a big step forward, was this wonderful thing that needed to happen. It was so strange for me to hear that. And a lot of it had to do with this withdrawal of social services. In neoliberalism, every person is free to enter into the market. And the goal of the government is not to coddle people, is not to hold people's hands, is not to support them directly. It's an indirect support. That is, they create the atmosphere for a good economy, a thriving economy where people can make money. But you need to enter that market. As a consequence of this, however, is that not just that people are going to enter the market, but that they are completely responsible for market failures as individuals. Now, when you're too big to fail, like the auto industry or banks, then the government will bail you out, which is totally against neoliberal principles. But as individuals, we are free to fail. This overlooks poverty, class warfare. This overlooks disability. This overlooks so much of the reality. It assumes this level playing field where everybody can just get up in one day and they can just go out and make some money. So much wealth is inherited wealth. Just look at anybody in the news right now and how much of their wealth is inherited. Yes, there are people who enter the free market and they want to be an actor. They finally become an actor or an actress. But that is such a slim margin of actual success that happens. The vast majority of people who go to Hollywood to make it big don't. And so what do we do with that when the very mechanisms in place that are said to secure people's freedom to enter into a place where they will be prosperous if they work doesn't actually reward most of us? What we can say is that meritocracy, where you're supposed to merit something by working hard, seems to be a failed promise. The withdrawal of social services is done for a number of reasons. And the belief generally is that you are a winner if you've won capitalism, as we've been talking about. You're making profit, you're a winner with neoliberalism. And that no one's going to no one's allowed to wreck you with a monopoly or a government power or something like that. But that no one's going to reward you for being lazy. We don't want lazy people, fair enough. We want contributing members of society. But who rescues those that fall beneath the line, that have always been poor, that have never had a leg up, that have never inherited wealth? Who helps those who are so far behind that have never had a level playing field? You're basically free to be alone. It's kind of a weird phrasing, but your freedom in this case is free to be left alone. But that's not what you want. You want to be helped. And there's no government there to do it if it's a strictly neoliberal government. You give people free health care. The concern is you make them weaker. You make them softer. You demotivate them to want to compete. And in doing that, you hurt society. You follow that kind of logic? Make people tough. Make people want to compete and be strong, be vicious in the free market, following the basic rules. I mean, not lying and cheating, because that would dissolve any kind of business relationship. But don't give handouts. Handouts kill culture. Handouts will kill the good life, so the belief goes. Pause on that. So in Canada right now, it's been touted as an opportunity or as an option to think about universal healthcare. COVID has been an opportunity to think about universal basic income, which means everybody, let's say everybody would get $1,200 a month. Every month for the rest of your life, you get $1,200. For many, especially in the US, they would hear that and they'd scream socialism. I mean, how could you possibly do that? Because then no one will want to work and no one will feel like COVID may be a unique situation because widespread economy, that's a problem. It's failing. Maybe not failing, not right, it's not doing well. But you don't want to do that when times are good, do you? Interesting. This is an example of one of those topics that's really a hot button topic, universal income. Let's flip this now. I don't have an answer to that, but let's flip this. And what happens when we're successful with capitalism, we're successful neoliberals, but we're just terribly immoral individuals, just terribly immoral. So I'm a billionaire and I'm supposed to be in a heterosexual monogamous marriage with my wife, but I'm not. I'm just having affairs and I'm cheating my business partners and I'm just doing whatever I want because I'm rich and I can get away with it and I can hire 20 lawyers. The moment something comes up I don't like, I just hire lawyers. It's astonishing to me, people like, again, Donald Trump, I talk about him too much, can be immoral and a failure in almost every regard as an individual. But because he has wealth, or at least he presents as having wealth, he's considered successful. Is that not the basic paradigm as to why Trump was able to become president? Money. He had money. And if so, you can be immoral and rich and seen as socially valuable. Isn't that kind of sad? Isn't that kind of like not how we want to run the world? What are your ideals for society? If you make lots of money, you deserve health care and food. So say the neoliberals. If you are poor, you deserve the consequences of being an economic failure. No excuses. Everyone is free, regardless of race or economic standing. Don't blame anybody else. You alone are responsible for this. Wilson is going to pick up on that and show how this is an example of a licensing to dehumanize other people. As a licensing to, here's an example, people who come to the US border and they're genuine refugees. So not the drug runners, which is a relatively small percentage, not the sex traffickers, the vast majority of people that show up at that border are in desperate need of food, desperate need of health care, and they're willing to work for it. They're willing to work hard. But the excuse to hate them becomes simply this: you're poor. You haven't been doing a good job at capitalism. Capitalism, neoliberalism is the standard for how things get done here. So why would we let you in? You're just going to be a tax on the system. Whether that's true or not, and seems to be largely untrue because they want to work, they're happy to work, and work jobs that the average American has no interest in doing. I'm generalizing now, obviously. This is a very frightening philosophy that looks at people in a very particular way based on a value of money and the value of their ability to compete in the free market. How many times have you met someone for the first time and the first thing that comes up is, oh, what do you do for a living? The person who drives the nice car, they do that to show that they're a winner in neoliberalism. The person who has a bigger house, 10,000 square foot house, even though there's only one of them, is a sign of success in neoliberalism. Less so giving to the poor, less so taking care of those in need, less so, and so on and so on. You get the idea. Our values are weird. One of the paradoxical situations for neoliberals, I can almost say that, is that they need a strong state. They argue we need to reduce government, reduce red tape, reduce people telling us what to do, but they simultaneously, and this is something you need to look into on your own, they need more government to regulate. So they say governments shouldn't be interventionist, and yet they are extremely interventionist. Again, 2008, the banks were running out of money, things were collapsing, oh, they're too big to fail, government shows up, gives them money. The Trump tax cut, right? Again and again, where we hear government is supposed to do less, what we actually see is government doing more, being more involved in regulating, deregulating too, all of the above. For the neoliberals, government is supposed to create military, defense force, police. There are supposed to be legal structures in place to maintain private property rights, to guarantee the markets are able to function. But what ends up happening is that we have greater and greater forms of surveillance and policing. So more and more police, with more and more people watching us, with more and more eyes on us constantly to keep us in check, to make sure that businesses are running the way they should, to make sure that we're good neoliberal business partners. One of the ways, in the US at least, that Wilson will argue that neoliberalism has been forced is through the role of incarcerations. That's why there's so many people in jail. The belief that she has is that there's this hostility towards people who are poor, who have failed neoliberalism. So what do you do with people who are marginalized? What do you do with people who are kind of basically discarded? Put them in jail, right? So you're going to focus your police force on black neighborhoods and make sure that they're the ideal target, right? They're already poor, they're a drain on the system, so we'll just scoop them up and put them in prison. It's strange, and I haven't looked into these studies exhaustively, but Wilson picks up on this idea that a lot of studies keep showing again and again that drug use is just as widespread in these poor, largely black neighborhoods, or all black neighborhoods, as they are in more privileged white neighborhoods. And yet the police don't focus equally on those. Economic standing has so much to do with how you are perceived as a winner or a loser. And of course, race plays into that and all these other things. Where we're going with this is the idea that while neoliberalism says freedom, 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 individual choice, it actually becomes a strange form of possessive individualism that is afraid of democracy and collective decision-making. And this radical individuality ends up making us less free. We're already trapped having to participate in a system that we might not want to participate in, that doesn't reward us, that is not giving us the merit that we actually earn. But now on top of all of that, we're forced to self-diagnose as winners or losers based on our profit margins. It's a very strange, that's a lack of freedom. It's a very strange way of perceiving my worth. One of the things that's really helpful about Wilson's text is that she argues, I mean, it's oversimplification, but she argues there are really kind of two antagonisms here. One are those who champion individual liberty. And again, I don't like the word liberty because I don't think neoliberalism is really about liberty, but let's just go with that word for now. That's kind of a loaded term. They champion individual liberty. This involves private property rights, you should have your own stuff, and free markets, so the government's maintaining a free market for us to spend and do what we want. And we should avoid government intervention. So what is individual liberty? It's that. But she says the other side of this are those who believe that government is responsible and should pursue a common good. And that you and I as individuals, of course, should pursue a common good as well. So instead of pursuing my good, my profit margin, I need to have in mind others. I need to have in mind that we as a collective must make collective decisions if we wish to be a healthy society. So what has history shown us? Wilson argues that as recently as a while back, but the Great Depression, that the individual liberty side, the neoliberal kind of way of thinking, showed itself to be utterly inadequate to large-scale transformations. And we might think of other examples, as she does, industrialization and urbanization, internationalization, large-scale corporations. The individual obsession with freedom, the individual liberty side, doesn't work when bad things happen. Look at any crisis, any economic crisis, and it isn't able to adapt because it has no way of appealing to the common good. And when it adapts, it is appealing to the common good side. Again, 2008 with the housing crisis, or now with COVID, billions and billions of dollars is flowing out of the government coffers to help people. That's the common good happening. But neoliberals aren't supposed to be able to do that. Neoliberalism says you are on your own. We supply the opportunity to be in the free market. The rest is up to you. The proof that neoliberalism has not worked historically, that this individual liberty side has not worked historically, is the growing political and economic elite, the divide between those who have and those who have not. That should be smaller and smaller and smaller. And it's not. And that's not even really debated much. I don't think I've heard of anybody really debating it. It's just, that's the problem. It's there and it's obvious. So when the catastrophic occurrences happen and neoliberalism isn't able to deal with it, well, then we need to think about that common good argument again. A common good philosophy that, well, hopefully, there's no reason to think that it can't maintain individual liberty, but with that concession that with individual liberty comes the responsibility to sometimes give in to the public good, what other people need. So it's not an either or. It's not an antagonism where we can't make our own choices. We have to completely give up our rights to think to society. That's too extreme. Examples of the common good philosophy being enacted after the Great Depression, according to Wilson, new laws were created that made banks responsible. They could no longer just haphazardly do what they wanted with your money, investing it in pyramid schemes or something like that. There were laws that said big banks, you get a lot of money, you need to be responsible with it. Rights were given to workers to organize, and the first unions, or some of the most important unions, began programs and policies to help with housing opportunities. Again, we're thinking about that common good. What's a common good? People having homes. So as individuals, should we just let them get into the free market? Well, we should let them get into the free market to make money, but then we should also help them, especially if they're disadvantaged in some way, to have a leg up so they're even closer to getting those homes. Helping people helps society. Helping people helps society. So again, we're back to my earlier confusion regarding why so many senators will go to the Senate floor and do speeches about helping big business but not helping individuals. And we see this with Wilson. She's arguing that the neoliberals see any kind of concession of social welfare services or common good as an existential threat, as the threat that undermines society. You can't be giving out money and expecting people to compete in the market in a competitive fashion. Okay. Cold, heartless, maybe. If working, no. Efficient, no. Less government, no. Oh, okay. What do we do now? Another way of framing this is to think of neoliberals as anti-socialists. Watch this video by Bernie Sanders and see what you think.
This is socialism for the rich. Amazon. Oh, by the way, I must say this if I may. We were quoting the liberal Washington Post owned by Jeff Bezos, the wealthiest guy in the world. So here is Jeff Bezos' company, Amazon, and they received a tax rebate. They paid nothing in 2018 in federal taxes. That's a corrupt tax system to begin with. But then on top of that, they received $129 million as a tax rebate. That, Senator Thune, is what socialism for the rich. In fact, this particular company is owned by the richest guy in the world. You gave him a $129 million rebate. But it's not just Amazon. Delta Airlines also paid nothing in federal taxes in 2018, and yet they received a $187 million rebate. Chevron, helping to destroy our planet with their carbon emissions, $181 million in a rebate. That, my friends, is what socialism for the rich is about. Socialism for the rich is not, in the midst of this terrible pandemic, putting a $2,000 check into the hands of working families. President, truth of the matter is that as a result of this pandemic, we are living through the worst and most difficult economic period since the Great Depression.
Notice how the term socialism factors into his speech, saying that everybody seems to be against socialism as this terrible thing, social services, giving money, doing more than just maintaining a free market, but actively getting into people's lives to help them. And he said, well, we're doing that with the rich. To the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, governments are getting into the lives of those who are extremely wealthy and helping them more. Isn't that a weird way of running neoliberalism? Isn't that hypocritical? Isn't that counterintuitive? I mean, the answer seems to be yes. Instead of giving Americans $2,000 checks each month to survive this incredible crisis, I think now it's $600, and Biden might raise it to $2,000. $600 a month, one of the worst economic crises since the Great Depression, and that individual liberty philosophy is failing. The individual liberty side can't adjust fast enough. But the common good side, championed by someone like Bernie's, who does call himself a democratic socialist, he uses the term, and he's not ashamed of the term, that's a different way of thinking about life and human value. The take-home point here is that most of us are suffering financial difficulties or precarity or precarious work situations because profit has been the goal, not a common good profit, but a profit to those who are born into it or have an advantage in some way, some who may just genuinely earn it, of course. And we see when governments no longer invest in helping people directly, in healthcare, in education, we see that direct result where sometimes people just can't help themselves. Think about that for a moment. Some people simply cannot help themselves, no matter how hard they work. They're doing everything that they may be working 15, 20, they may be working every hour of every day, but it's a minimum wage job without any benefits, and they can get fired on a dime, and they have no other alternatives. Well, they can go to school. Can they go to school? Well, they can go to night school. Can they? I mean, we need to come to this point in which the idea of neoliberalism as opening up this space for you to do business is naive. It's naive. It overlooks how people actually live. It overlooks the brutality and the competition of the world. It's an overly simplistic philosophy, I believe. Here's what we know about economics today. For the most part, I don't know that anybody would disagree with this. We have, generally speaking, lower wages. So even though you may be making more and more a little bit every year, when you adjust for inflation, if an apple cost $10 yesterday, apples don't cost $10, but if it cost $10 yesterday, today it'll cost a $10.25. Same apple, but it costs more and more and more. So when homes in Canada are ridiculously overpriced right now. So when you adjust for inflation, nobody can really afford to buy a home. It's just not realistic. Increased job security. We'll talk about that again in my own context of my own life. Loss of benefits and protections, including union protections. All of these things seem to be happening. Not everywhere, of course, but by and large, it seems to be the situation. So bring all this conversation together, and here's where Wilson takes it. There is a class war going on right now, she argues, in which the poor have been criminalized. The poor. Generally speaking, that'll be if you're a visible minority poor, but just poor in general. The trailer trash, whatever, however you want to, these idioms that we want to use. You're the enemy. Why? Again, because you are being blamed for not being successful. It doesn't matter if you came from a poor neighborhood. It doesn't matter if your parents were divorced or sick or something like that. None of that matters. You failed at capitalism. You're standing in the way of social progress. You're standing in the way of success. So you either get out of the way, you become invisible, or we incarcerate you, or we shame you. We shame you. Think about that. Is there a neoliberal class war where governments are incentivizing police forces, as Wilson argues, by giving them equipment and whatnot to focus on poor neighborhoods? Not because, again, there's greater drug use or greater crime even, but because they're the enemy, because they're poor. We saw this with the Trump administration demonizing Mexican immigrants. That was a clear declaration of war, that the people who were visibly needy were considered less human because they weren't American, because they weren't successful capitalist American. I don't even know how to describe it. What this means is that we're all living more vulnerable lives. There's a vicious cycle of competition between the people who already have very little. The average person already has relatively little. And this vicious competition doesn't seem to really serve anybody except the people who are already very wealthy. We're scrambling for jobs, to get our jobs back from robots, to get our jobs back from being deported overseas or something like that. And so each of us is fighting our neighbor for scarce resources and scarce jobs, while the people who own these companies are becoming increasingly wealthy. This is the opposite of the common good argument, but very much a product of neoliberalism, where the goal is you can't tell people what to do with their money, short of some taxation, and the goal is profit above all else. Well, this is what we should have expected. This is very much what we should have assumed would happen in a neoliberal, intensified social and economic insecurity, and intensified insecurity vulnerability. Another interesting point Wilson makes is that you and I are being trained to be business savvy rather than critical thinkers, rather than philosophers, rather than people who ask big questions about life. Our very sense of what makes an important question is being narrowed to financial gain or financial something. Is that true? Well, I can say in my own life in high school, I was given a lot of courses in accounting, typing, business generally, and almost no courses in like a philosophy of meaning of life. What makes a good person? So in my case, yeah, I can see where I've been trained from the very beginning to be a neoliberal thinker, someone who can participate in the market and survive and make a profit. And so I went to school, and we'll get into the oversharing of my own life in just a second, but I went to school. I've spent the better part of 15 years getting a bunch of degrees so I could be a professional, a working professional, because I was told that if I was a working professional that I would have something of a guaranteed income, that if I worked hard and I paid my dues, that I would be rewarded. Again, meritocracy. And I was taught that since high school. I was lied to since high school, but we'll get into that in a minute. So let's test the theory, all of this conversation. What's your experience? Has your experience been one of open free thought to get people thinking outside the box, or of getting you to conform to sort of this liberal, neoliberal ideal of money-making savvy business type person? We need to be careful. We're not just talking about bankers or financial experts or investors. We're talking about people who identify, their very identity is related to, do I have a nice house? Do I have a nice car? I am a successful person when I have money in the bank. Because if that's how you identify with success, maybe you don't like that. Maybe you don't like that liberal, neoliberal ideal. Let's look at this quote from Wilson. Generally speaking, precarity, strange word, generally speaking, precarity describes the dynamics of work in everyday life in the global neoliberal economy, where the web of social and political constraints has been shredded beyond repair. So the economy is incredibly precarious. The idea of things being stable has been just thrown out, shredded beyond repair. And with it, fantasies of the good life and the myth of the American dream. So fantasies of the good life and the myth of the American dream, she says, for those who are paying attention, are gone. Workers, and why? Because workers today are constantly subject to threats such as downsizing, layoffs, plant and branch closures. One's livelihood and thus life is constantly under threat. I read that paragraph and I went, yeah, that's my life. So let me get into the oversharing part now. Again, so this is a personal thing, but I think it connects very well to neoliberalism. A lot of people don't like talking about how much money they make in their careers and whatnot, but I think this is really important. So again, under neoliberalism, it's supposed to be a meritocracy. If you work, if you have a skill, if you bring something to the table, you're supposed to be rewarded for it. You merit what you earn. You merit lots, you don't, Fine. Can you fight for it? Well, I am an example of someone that I don't think, I'm just speaking on my own behalf now, but I don't think anyone would ever call me lazy. I don't think anyone who knows me would ever call me lazy. I'm a fighter. I get things done. I'm very driven. I do more than I need to do. So it's not just survivability where I get by with a minimum. I invest effort, and at least I hope. But again, I think other people would see that. Now, if you were to look at my resume, you would see just objectively that seems to be true. That is, when you compare me as an academic to my peers, I typically publish more, I do more community service. Now, not always. I'm sure there are individuals here or there, but over the years, you get some sense of where you are in this general hierarchy. I've been teaching for 10 years. I publish in the right journals for the most part, and I publish in the right books. I just published another book through Routledge, which is a huge achievement. So on paper, I seem to excel. Right? I have a good resume. Now in real life, I might be a jerk, so that might be the problem. I'm a jerk. But on paper, I excel. But I don't have a full-time job. I don't have a full-time job. What I have are jobs here, jobs here, jobs here at university. And every 4 months, I have to apply, and I hope that I will get new jobs. Now, I have 2 kids, a mortgage, a cat, a wife, some goldfish in an aquarium. I want to work, and I work really hard when I have jobs. But I've been teaching for 10 years. I spent better than a decade getting 6 degrees, advanced degrees, so that I could be a professional. And the university at that time, at the beginning, that's where you would have a good job. You wouldn't be driving around in a yacht in the Mediterranean, but you would have a consistent income. Now, this is not just sour grapes here. I'm trying to drive home that this neoliberal ideal of competitiveness and being competitive has not and is not working for many people, because I'm not alone. For those of you who are in universities or colleges in Canada, upwards of 40 to 50% of your courses are taught by people like me. No permanent job, no health care, and very few, really, no prospects. Because we're locked into a life of being an academic, and the universities know it. So what happens is that the university will hire me to teach a course for, let's say they teach a course for $9,000 and the taxes and everything else. So no healthcare, just here's some money. They'll give you 1% or something, and they'll call it healthcare or something like that. You couldn't even go to the dental office for what they give you, but that's fine. So there's no healthcare, no drug plan coverage. I could pay for a drug plan coverage. I could pay for dental coverage if I knew I had a job and I could afford it. But the actual coverage costs are more than I would spend at the dentist in a year. So it makes no sense by the time I pay for premiums. And this is the same problem we see with so many Americans in the US, right? That you don't have a stable job to even afford the premiums that would cost more than the health coverage you're going to get. Okay. In fact, if you're one of my students, you have significantly better health coverage than I do. Again, not sour grapes. Again, just pointing out, isn't that weird? Isn't that weird? Also, if I represent people teaching half the courses who are part-time, getting paid course by course, and who routinely get let go every summer. So in the summer, the people who are teaching half the courses, they go on unemployment because they literally have no work. Their employer has fired them, and now they're on the payroll of the government to survive. In my case, I've been very fortunate. I've been able to work at different universities and often find summer courses, but that's often not the case. Many people are only able to work at one school, and I'm going to say this without I'm trying not to get emotional, because it angers me when I see my colleagues unable to take their children to the dentist in one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Again, I'm lucky. My wife works full-time, and I've been very fortunate to find work, so we're able to piece things, but so many professors with PhDs aren't. Very few people are talking about it. And understandably, because it's one of those things where people don't really know that these professionals are not getting paid. The meritocracy at university has been destroyed. And I say that, I mean, destroyed is a strong word, but I mean it. So how is it that half the courses can be with faculty who are making $100,000 a year, and the other are with faculty getting $8,000 or $9,000 a course, if that? And the answer is very simple. Because the common good argument has failed, and the idea of equality, of fairness, of a distribution of resources, that ideal has just kind of been let go. It's gone. New York University in Ontario is an example of a university that fights very, very hard. Its union fights very, very hard. And this is just before COVID. The union said, we're not going to send our part-time faculty back to work until you can give them some kind of job security. Again, don't give them a yacht, give them some job security. No. Went through arbitration, and then a new government was voted in. Ford ordered people back to work. A violation of the union, a violation of our freedom to withdraw our own labor so that we can get better working conditions. It's just one of those things where you hear about it and you see it in the news, but you don't realize that neoliberalism at work actually means, for many people, dehumanizing, demoralizing. It's emasculating as a man. It's emasculating to look at my children and not know if I'm going to be able to make payments on the house next month. Again, in my case, I've been very fortunate, but so many are not. Okay, so that all sounds like sour grapes. What am I saying? I work really hard. I haven't been rewarded. Maybe it's because I'm a jerk. Maybe I'm disillusioned. But I broke my leg. This is actually my first time in this office in 3 months. As I'm sitting here right now, my leg is lifted up. I really broke it. I broke it bad. Walking down the side of the hill, carrying about 70 pounds in gas cans, and I slipped, and I caught my foot, and I stopped myself from falling, but in doing that, I literally shattered my leg, broke my leg. So I'm there on the ground. I actually started to pass out at one point. It's really bad. The ambulance comes. My poor kids are watching this, and I'm swearing up a storm. I don't like swearing in front of my kids, so I really, I'm inventing new swear words. It hurts so bad. But the ambulance shows up, and I love the two women that were there because they gave me morphine. Right. So anybody who gives you morphine, you got to like them. But they were like, well, you know what? This is too dangerous. So they called the fire department to get me out into the ambulance. I'm like, great, cool. Get more people because I just slipped down this hill. More people, the better. Get me to the hospital. They're taking x-rays, and there were at least 6 people around me. They thought I had broken my femur. They thought this, they thought that. So all these things are happening. A few weeks later, I was doing another follow-up x-ray, and I asked the technician, how much was this machine? And she said, well, that plate that's just behind your leg, the plate was about this big, and the x-ray machine takes an x-ray. The plate's about $150,000. So I started thinking about money, right? The money. I'm in Canada. I didn't worry about the bill. But I don't have medical coverage for medicines, and I needed a lot of them. And I didn't have coverage for an ambulance, so that's like $45. I didn't have coverage for the brace on my thing. Anyway, it cost me personally about $250. For all of the stuff that happened, all the drugs, I had to do surgery. I'm just still recovering from huge surgery. It was ridiculous. So how much? $100,000? $150,000? I don't know. And I didn't have to pay. Because I live in a society that says the common good argument. I can't afford health care, and yet I still received the vast majority of the health care that I needed. That's a big deal. Yes, I'm still out of pocket some expenses. Yes, it's kind of scary. And if I was someone who worked outside, a roofer or something, oh wow, I would have been really in a lot of trouble. Neoliberalism on its own says you're free to enter into the market. If you get success, wonderful. But if you break a leg, boo-hoo, too bad for you. I'm so thankful to live in a country with socialized medicine. I see the failures of neoliberalism in my own life and in my colleagues who literally cannot afford. I had a colleague who went over a month, I believe. He needed a root canal and he couldn't afford to do it. And he's teaching my students, he's probably teaching you if you're one of my students. That's how screwed up the system is in terms of the neoliberal agenda and how that seeped into the corporatization of universities. Again, I don't like that sour grape thing. But I too devalue myself, and I think of myself as a failure when I do an application for a full-time job and I don't get it. It is so hard to think of ourselves outside of that neoliberal paradigm. I struggle with it all the time. To think of myself as successful, say a father or something. Oh, who cares about that? Money. It's all about the money. No, there's so much more than an obsession about money. Being kind, being compassionate, empathetic, connected with people, charitable. Okay, it's a long-winded way of saying that if I had broken my leg in a purely neoliberal world, I probably wouldn't be living in this house much longer if it was purely neoliberal. Because I wouldn't have been able to afford insurance and I wouldn't have been able to afford to live here. So thankful to be living in Canada. What do we do with all this? Again, you need to decide personally whether you think the kinds of freedoms and promises by neoliberalism are fact or fantasy. For my part, I think they're very much fantasy.